everybody hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, it's lovely to see so many familiar faces here on my screen. I feel particularly grateful to be able to be with you today. I was saying to Lisa last week, I'm very excited by this sort of emerging, developing way of gathering that has happened for our community in this time. As much as we have lost, as much has been interrupted and disrupted during this time, the way in which this community has found ways of reinventing certain ways of connecting and communicating inspires me and gives me hope. And as I look at all of your tiny faces in these tiny boxes, I'm feeling another wave of hope in this moment too. I just wanted to start by sharing some reflections. Many of these reflections will probably sound very familiar to things that those of you who have been in class with me have heard me talk about on any number of occasions, but I want to try to make some connections today, thinking about this particular season of our lives and the life of our world. And then I'd also really be happy to hold some space for some discussion as well, to hear from you and maybe to respond if I can. So I, as I always do, have been thinking about the ways in which this time it might be helpful for us to have some conversations about trauma and about the moral dimensions of trauma. I say to you confessionally, I am biased in that direction. I spend an inordinate amount of time, in fact, thinking about trauma studies and the moral dimensions of trauma. But as natural as it is for me to be thinking about those things, I've been thinking about those things in some new ways during these weeks and these months of the pandemic. And part of what I hope today can provide for us as a community is an opportunity, as we acknowledge some of these dimensions, that we would feel a little bit more acquainted and familiar with these dimensions, both in terms of how they impact our lives and also how we may be seeing them play out in our work, in our family, in the communities that we're connected to as well. It's amazing to me how often trauma goes overlooked. And I don't mean the kind of big, obvious traumas, right? I mean, if someone that we care about is in a car accident, or if we're in a car accident, it's easy for kind of everyone to pay attention to that, right? As that was a traumatic event. But there are so many other kinds of trauma than those kind of acute events, those kinds of particular bad days or bad moments that happen in our life. And those events are traumatic in the same way that all traumas are. And so if we understand trauma not just as being a sort of singular bad moment or bad day kind of event in our lives, but rather trauma is that human experience in which we are overwhelmed, our kind of normal functioning is overwhelmed. That's really a better understanding of what trauma is. And that can happen in the aftermath of an acute traumatic event like a car accident. But it can also happen in some other ways. And so can we broaden our vision to think about the way in which traumatic stress may be emerging in our lives during this time? Because in fact, I think the traumatic stress that has surfaced and intensified during these months of the pandemic have no doubt looked like traumatic stress to me, but it hasn't, again, happened in an acute kind of way. It's happened in this kind of full total way. And when I say overwhelming our kind of normal functioning, all of that happens for us in different ways, right? What's normal for me isn't normal for Lisa, isn't normal for President Ray, right? We all kind of have our own normal. So when I say normal, I don't mean any kind of essentialized sense of standards, but rather kind of what is normal life for me. And I think each of us have experienced some interruption, some disruption to what normal life is for each of us. And again, that's particular, it's special to you and to your family. And it's not just again, something that we might think of as being the sort of particularly bad stuff, but trauma has a way of overwhelming sometimes very small stuff, right? The way that we think about something, the feelings that we might be having, the beliefs that we might have about the way the world works, or what my identity is, where my place in all of this is. Trauma has a way of overwhelming our sometimes very simple, very basic habits and behaviors and routines. That's a place where I have felt some particular stress, and maybe you have too, right? I can't go to the places that I'm used to going. I can't go with my family, the places that we're used to going as a family unit. I haven't been able to gather for worship with my faith community in the same kind of way, right? So these kinds of habits, these routines, these places where we normally, for each of us, feel these points of connection have been interrupted. And as I acknowledged about our gathering here today, there are ways in which we are creatively reinventing some of these ways of connecting that happens in the aftermath of all kinds of trauma too, right? We sort of think of that as being clinically, we talk about that as post-traumatic growth, right? That not everything that happens after trauma is devastating and debilitating, but there's some stuff that gets discovered, there's some stuff that gets learned and reinvented as a part of what that is. The other thing that happens with trauma that I've been thinking a lot about is trauma has a way of changing the way that we experience space and time. And I think the biggest impact that I have felt when it comes to time is we don't know when these particular sets of conditions are going to change, right? Lots of people are saying, when do we get to go back to normal? That's sort of more complicated than we make it sound, but even in terms of when is change going to come, right? Here's Sam Cooke singing this to us, right? Change is going to come, but we don't really know when that's going to come. So what does that mean for us? Well, it's hard for us as a species when we, in fact, don't have a sense of time as being a finite, and for many of us, a sort of controllable or schedulable kind of force in our cosmologies, right? So it's a lot easier for me in my life, my day-to-day life, if I know when things are going to get back to this other thing, right? I know that my work day is going to conclude about this time of day, and then I'll get to go do some other things. The circumstances and the conditions of this pandemic have taken that away from all of us. We don't have a sense of when things are going to open, when it's going to be safe for us to see our friends or our family, to be able to gather with our community. These are all big questions for us. It's appropriate that they're big questions because these are important places of connection for us. But this fits with our understanding of how this has been a traumatic experience for us, because that sense of time has been kind of deeply and structurally sidelined and changed for us in that way. And trauma has a way of changing the way that we think about space. And this has also been very true in this pandemic. I realize that for many of you, as well as times in my life, doing active ministry work, there are ways in which we anticipate going into certain kinds of situations that will be more demanding of us. Yes, for some of us that may be going and showing up to do congregational leadership. For others of us that may be going to do chaplaincy kind of work, where we know we're going to meet people in crisis with particular needs, who are going to come with a whole bunch of, maybe life-limiting, death-dealing kinds of projections on ministry professionals. I want you to fix my problem. I want you to be able to do this. There's a way in which we can anticipate when we're going to show up in those spaces, right? For some of us, we have a commute, right? for others of us, there's a particular building that kind of holds those needs, right? If we go to work at a hospital, or we go to work at a prison or a jail. For some of us doing military chaplaincy, you actually put on a uniform, right? And the uniform says, hey, now I'm working in this space. Well, there's a way in which this pandemic has um, really sort of taken the bottom out of the foundations of where some of those demarcations of space are in our lives. There isn't any space in my life, and I would guess this is true for you, that isn't impacted in big and small ways by this pandemic, right? I can't go to work. I can't have a conversation with a colleague. I can't advise a student. I can't have dinner with my family. I can't take my dog for a walk without the impact of the pandemic being felt in that space. And the sort of inescapability of the pandemic is very much attuned to what trauma feels like. One of the ways that sometimes folks who are trauma survivors get identified is that they're acting in a way that doesn't really seem like it fits in the space, right? So the person sort of looks out of place. This is a situation where kind of everything else has put us out of place, right? We are not the same kinds of agents of our worlds in the way that we're accustomed to being, and that all of our spaces have been saturated by this particular impact. And as I would guess many of you have experienced, I certainly have experienced, that is exhausting. It is exhausting to not have any hiding places from this, right? To not be able to leave all of that behind and go somewhere where I can recover, somewhere where I can rest, somewhere where I can laugh without the burdens of what that hard day was about. Whatever those coping strategies might be like in your life, I don't have any coping strategies that are free and clear of this pandemic, right? My partner in life is subjected to this pandemic. My children are subjected to this pandemic. Um, those relationships that I would look to connect with in those times where I'm feeling worn out, that I would look to say, help me to kind of feel anchored again, and be ready for this next day. All those folks are dealing with it too. And that has a particular challenge to our notions of what rest and recovery, what sustainability look like in this time too. So I say all of this, hopefully not to sort of sink us into despair, but rather to acknowledge with humility and honesty what it is that all of us are being subjected to in this time. And I say that as a way to acknowledge it, to affirm that if you are feeling tired, but maybe also having trouble sleeping, I'm feeling that way. If you are thinking about what's happening with my devotional life, what's happening with my prayer life, what's happening with um, those particular spiritual practices that help me to get reoriented or grounded when I need them most. They don't seem like they're working like they used to. I'm feeling that too. I'm grateful for opportunities like this where we can see a little of each other and hear from each other a little bit, because I think we are, in a way, reaching toward one another to make those connections, to remind each other of our connections, even in a small way. Those are important things. And I want us to be able to be cognizant of that, because we also may be in positions where we can help others to acknowledge that too. That the idea that many of us are attuned to, what's going on with the workers at the grocery store, what's going on with first responders at the hospital. Those are all maybe what we would think of as being sort of on the front lines of the pandemic, and maybe the traumatic stress is more acute, more intense in those spaces. I want us to acknowledge that every single one of us, no matter our proximity to whatever we perceive as being the front lines, we are also being subjected to some of this traumatic stress in different shapes and forms. And I hope that we can hold that for ourselves, that we can find the kind of support that we need during this time. But we can't do that if we don't acknowledge it. So I mean to acknowledge this as a way, hopefully, to kind of authorize some space and some energy for us to say, yeah, I'm tired, and I'm tired today. And guess what? You're not going to be tired every day, right? Some days it feels altogether different. And all of that is right and natural and appropriate for it to happen. Many of us are familiar with thinking about stages of grief or complex grief, and sometimes it feels like this and sometimes it feels like that. Trauma is that way too. And when we have dealt with something like this that involves this degree of uncertainty, this degree of danger and perceived threat, um, there are different ways to feel about it. So there isn't, I don't mean to suggest any kind of right way of doing any of this. I mean to acknowledge the complicatedness of it, and the particular way that you're making your way through, and to celebrate what it is for us to be able to be together as a community, to share with each other kind of what's up with us today. Those conversations have been life-saving for me over these weeks. And I hope you all are finding the spaces and the places and the people to have those kinds of space, to do that work and have those conversations too. If it's okay, I would be happy to open it up and have a little bit of give and take, if there are particular questions